purpose behind this video is to give you a little more clarification than the textbook does about the different components on the engine that we were just talking about in the chapter assignments. So basically I've got an engine block here that's been cut away. Now the engine block itself is going to be this cast iron piece here, and if you notice the pistons are kind of on a angle like this, so that would be a V configuration. We've got 3 pistons on each side, so 1, 2, 3 on each side, and so that would be a V6 engine. If it was an inline engine, all the pistons would be straight. Now over here like on the table, I've got a crankshaft out of an engine and a piston out of an engine. So we'll start with the piston first. This piece right here is called the connecting rod. The connecting rod comes up here, and if you notice there's a pin on the top of the piston right up here, or right in the middle of the piston, that allows the piston to pivot like this. And so what that is called the wrist pin. So this is the connecting rod. This part right here is what actually hooks on or clamps around the crankshaft. Now this is called a journal. So this is the crankshaft where the piston, the connecting rod, clamps onto the crankshaft journal. These other journals here, if you notice, there's 3 of them, or actually 5 of them. There's one here, one here, one here, there, and they're all kind of in a line. Those are the main journals. Okay, so these journals are where the bearings actually run in the engine block, and so the piston or the crankshaft turns on these 5 journals. These other 1, 2, 3, 4 journals, these are all connected to connecting rods on the piston, so like this one here. And so when the piston's going up and down, it's pushing on these journals right here and turning that crankshaft in this direction. Now if you look at the piston, when the piston goes up and down, it allows the crankshaft is able to move around like this. So the piston is actually going up and down in a sleeve like this, and the connecting rod is able to go this direction here on the crankshaft. With the piston, you have the piston itself. This part right here is called the skirt. This right here is the top of the piston. And then if you notice, you got 3 rings here. So these first 2 are solid rings, and this one here is kind of several rings put together. These 2 are the compression rings. This one is the oil ring. And what the job is, these 2 on the compression, they hold the compression in. So on that compression stroke, when the piston comes up to the top, these are the rings that seal the cylinder, or seal the piston inside the cylinder. This other ring down here, the oil ring, that's the one that keeps the oil from actually getting up in on top of the piston and burning inside the engine. So when these oil rings go bad, that's when you have a lot of the blue smoke coming out of the tailpipe. And so that's and then of course this is the connecting rod right here. This is the rod cap. So you may have heard the term engine that spun a rod or spun a bearing or threw a rod, you know, those kind of things. That's the way engines sometimes fail. When an engine spins a bearing, these bearings right here, let's see if I can move this out. I'll take this rod cap off and I'll show you the bearing inside here. Now we're going to talk a little bit more about this in a little more detail later on in the quarter. But this right here is the bearing that goes inside the connecting rod. This actually rides on the crankshaft. Actually, there's a little film of oil that goes right there in it, and that's what makes it spin around on the crankshaft. And so when a engine fails to the point where the bearing spins, what happens is this bearing here, you notice it's kept in there with a little keeper. What will happen is that bearing wears to the point where it'll actually spin around like this inside that rod cap, and it'll jam up and it'll actually seize the rod, so the rod can't go up and down anymore. And that's what we have when we have a spun bearing in an engine. When you hear that term that an engine threw a rod, what that usually means is that this connecting rod right here, for whatever reason, broke. And so as the piston's going up and down, that rod swings out because it's no longer attached to the crankshaft. So it swings out like this, and it'll actually, sometimes it'll punch right through the side of the cylinder block. Now let's go look at this engine over here. This engine, you can see the cylinders right here. So if you look down inside the cylinder, you can see the crankshaft down in there with the bearings. And as the crankshaft spins around, you can see how that bearing journal comes up and around like that. And now if we look on this side over here, you can see the piston going up and down inside of the cylinder bore. And so that piston fits in there really nice and snug, and those compression rings are what keeps it from going up in there. Now if you remember the 4 strokes of an engine, we've got intake, and then the piston comes back up as onto compression, and then the spark plug will fire the air fuel mixture, and we have compression, or sorry, power, and then we have exhaust when the piston comes all the way back up. So if you notice, that was 4 times the piston went up and down, so it went up once, down twice, up 3 times, and down 4 times. And if you notice the crankshaft while I'm doing this, if you look at the piston, we're going to start with the piston at top dead center. We go rotate it around here, piston's at bottom dead center. That's 180 degrees. Now we rotate it around back to top dead center. That's another 180 degrees. And then back to bottom dead center, another 180. And then back up to top dead center, and that's 720 total. So that's 2 complete revolutions of the crankshaft. Now let's look at the valves over here. If you look at this piston over here, you can see the piston at the top dead center. You've got a valve here and a valve here. And those valves are open and closed via push rods and the camshaft that goes down inside the engine block there. So the camshaft is going to push these rods up and down, which is going to open up and close those valves. So if you watch the valves, so there's the intake valve. It just opened up. Now the valve is closing. The piston comes up to the compression stroke. Boom! Spark plug fires. If you notice, both valves are closed. Piston goes down on the power stroke. Now you notice that big valve opening up, this one right here, and that's the exhaust valve. So it opens up, all the exhaust comes out. Now if you notice there, it's kind of hard to see, but there's a little bit of time when both of those valves are open at the same time. That's called valve overlap. We're going to talk a little bit more about that later in the quarter. So then we go back down here. This is the intake, compression, power, exhaust. Intake, compression, power, exhaust. So I'm going to start this thing up. This actually works with a little electric motor, and then I'll kind of spin around so you can kind of see what's going on with it. Okay, I've got the engine running now. You can see the piston going up and down right here in the cylinder bore. And if you look at the crankshaft down there, see it spinning around? And down inside here, you can kind of see the camshaft spinning around. Over here on the front part, okay, this is going to be your crankshaft here. This is your camshaft. And the chain that's attaching those two together is called your timing chain. And so the crankshaft here and the camshaft here have to be timed together. That's called cam timing. It's different than ignition timing for the spark plugs up here. But anyway, when this thing's spinning around like this, now if we look up here, we can see the intake, compression, power, exhaust. So we got intake, compression, power, exhaust. I can't even say it that fast. So you can see the valves opening and closing as the piston comes up and down. Then as we move around here, you can see we've got a lifter down in here. Normally, if all the pistons were in this engine block, you would have lifters in each one of these. But I have some of them in there so you can see what they're doing. There's the lifters over there, you can see that. And then back here, where I've got my crank on there, this big wheel back here is usually what's going to be connected to the transmission. And so if it's a standard transmission, it's going to be a flywheel. If it's an automatic transmission, it'll be a clutch. It'll be a flex plate. So hopefully this clears up, or this makes it a little more easy to understand the basic operation and function of an engine.